Very good. We are recording. My name is John Moorhead, and I am with Multifaith Matters. And we are privileged today to have a conversation with Elmer Thiessen. I came across his work a few years ago. I was doing an online journal, an editor at the time of a Sacred Tribes journal, and we did a special focus on the subject of predatory proselytism, allegations that in India, Christian missionaries were engaging in unethical forms of evangelism. And so one of the pieces of that edition was an interview, a written interview with Elmer regarding one of his books, and we're privileged to have him back. The reason this has come on my radar again and has been an issue of continuing interest for me is not only that that charge out of India, but more recently on Facebook, I came across a post by, I think he's a Christian activist in regards to peacemaking with Islam. And he had posted on his page something that he found from a Sikh activist who had come across an article from the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization talking about friendship evangelism. And the concern was that that was unethical. And he went even further and said that all religions that are exclusivistic equal supremacist religion. And that piqued my curiosity. I think this is a topic of continued interest. So we've got Elmer here to talk about some issues related to it. Elmer, can you talk a little bit about your background that you bring to this subject matter?
Yes, I started out researching in the area of education, philosophy of education, particularly the problem of indoctrination. Religious parents often are accused of indoctrinating their children. Religious schools are often accused of indoctrinating. And I wanted to explore what's behind that, and discovered that there's a lot of confusion about the concept of indoctrination. But here we are dealing with really the matter of influence within a classroom, and it's this topic of influence and persuasion that finally moved over into my study of the ethics of evangelism. So perhaps I should just move on and talk about my first book.
Yeah, talk a little bit about your first book, which is how I found you, The Scandal of Evangelism, a Biblical Study of the Ethics of Evangelism.
Right.
Well, what motivated you for that?
Yeah, I partly grew out of my earlier concerns in education, but also I was evangelical Christians really had not talked a lot about the ethics of evangelism. I started working on this about 20 years ago and discovered there were some articles. There was one code of ethics by InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. But other than that, very little was written specifically on ethics of evangelism. And there was more written by critics of evangelism. And what I wanted to explore was, are those criticisms valid? So that's sort of what piqued my interest. In part, it was also very personal. I grew up in an evangelical environment that stressed evangelism, and I was uncomfortable about some of the things that we were asked to do. And so I wanted to explore that and discovered that part of my discomfort was legitimate because some evangelism was not being done in an ethical manner.
Now, who was your initial audience for that first book?
Yeah, the first book was written very specifically for two readerships. I was writing for people who were critical of evangelism, who would say things like, all evangelism is unethical, or the weaker claim, most of it is unethical. So I was trying to address those. And then I was also writing for religions that were very much committed to evangelism and proselytizing. So I had two readerships in mind. In my writing, I've been very concerned to try and bridge the divide between believers and unbelievers. So I was writing for these two readerships, and when you write for two audiences, you generally don't quite satisfy either of them completely. But that's certainly part of what I felt I needed to do. So I had two objectives: answering these objections, these various objections that evangelism is intolerant, evangelism is coercive, evangelism is arrogant, evangelism is divisive, and try to answer those and show that those arguments that give a wholesale condemnation of all evangelism are simply unsound. If that's the case, then what we need to spend more time on is developing criteria to distinguish between ethical and unethical evangelism. And that was really the second part of my book and the focus of the second part.
And then you've got another volume on the topic, the Scandal of Evangelism, a biblical study of the ethics of evangelism. How is that book different? What was the next chapter for you?
Well, in my first book, I made a statement that every evangelizing religion should really be working on this topic of the ethics of evangelism from within its own religious tradition. And in a footnote, I promised that I wanted to do this myself for the Christian religion. So the second book is really a promise I made in the first book. And so I started working on this book to prepare myself for this exercise. I read through the whole Bible. Well, I will admit I skimmed some parts. But I read through the whole Bible to see if there were, and try to highlight any passages that I would see as relevant to the topic of the ethics of evangelism, and discovered that there were really quite a lot. There's quite a lot said about the ethics of evangelism in the Bible. If you're looking with this specific aim, you have this specific aim in mind. So the first part of my book then is an inductive study of the Gospels, of the writings of Paul and Peter and John, to see what they say about the ethics of evangelism. And from that inductive study, I developed 30 criteria for ethical evangelism, or 30 guidelines for ethical evangelism, which I grouped under various headings. One of them was foundational guidelines. And here I appealed to the Great Commandment, the Golden Rule, the dignity of persons. I had some guidelines regarding coercion, guidelines regarding personal relationships. How do we relate to people when we're evangelizing? The principle of love, tolerance, caring for the other person. Guidelines regarding motivation as well. And here I try to suggest that if we're looking for numbers, if we're trying to chalk up numbers of the people we've converted, there's something unethical going on here. So after developing these 30 guidelines, in the second part of the book, I apply these 30 guidelines to some specific topics. The evangelism of children, evangelism in professional life. And here I focus specifically on the academy, which I'm familiar with. And then also the relationship between evangelism and humanitarian aid and social justice and those kinds of things. So the second part was more practical and orientation.
In the text that accompanies our conversation today, I'll have the titles of your books and links to them, and I encourage folks to follow up on this. This conversation does not by any means exhaust the topic, and so I encourage some further reading. It's interesting that you said that you had some ethical concerns about numbers. I lost one of my major supporting churches in terms of mission support for my work because I wasn't showing numbers, and that wasn't part of my methodology. So I'm sympathetic to that. How are you defining evangelism and related terms like mission and proselytism?
There's really quite a bit of controversy regarding these terms. I talk about evangelism, first of all, in broad terms, because I think evangelism occurs in various contexts, and was surprised to discover that some businesses even have evangelists for their products, and they use the term evangelists. So here evangelism is understood in terms of trying to convert the person, to try and help the person to change their beliefs or their behavior or their identity and buy their product. And this is a very broad sense. Christian evangelism, I define in terms of the verbal proclamation of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, which involves the entire gospel, of course, which is not only about personal salvation, but also about the kingdom of God and the beauty and the wonder of the kingdom of God. So that is the specific definition of Christian evangelism. Missions I see as a broader concept, which involves social justice, working for justice, working for peace, and giving humanitarian aid. And evangelism I see as part of this broader concept of mission. Proselytism, in my first book, I use these as synonyms because proselytism can be a synonym for evangelism. And I have been criticized quite severely for doing that because for many people, especially in ecumenical circles, proselytism is viewed as a pejorative term. And I think there's some problems with that. I prefer to simply use one word, evangelism, and then talk about ethical evangelism and unethical evangelism. But there are some who simply use a different word, proselytism, for unethical evangelism. There's a third meaning of proselytism, and that is sheep stealing, where you're entering into an Orthodox territory, evangelicals entering into Orthodox domain and evangelizing in that area. So that's another unique definition of proselytism and a unique problem, which I address in my second book.
Part of what you said in that answer there kind of relates to my next question. And in my experience, there seems to be more concern about evangelism in interreligious contexts rather than, say, in advertising or politics or what have you. From my understanding, we're trying to persuade others all the time about different things. And if we want to use the label evangelism, that's what's going on. So it seems like for whatever reason, there's a concern in the religious context. How can we create space for proper forms of persuasion in religion?
And I agree with you entirely that we need to recognize that evangelism is a broader concern which occurs in all kinds of contexts. There's a writer who said that human beings are persuading and persuaded animals, that we're always persuading, about all kinds of things, but including persuasion in the area of our deeply held beliefs. So I think we need this broader definition, and if we want to allow for persuasion in other areas, it's only fair, I think, to say that we should also allow for persuasion in the religious area and in the interreligious area. So I think consistency requires that we simply acknowledge that persuasion occurs all the time, and that we should be fair and open about allowing for persuasion in various contexts, including religion.
Let's bring a little critique to some aspects of Christian evangelism. I mentioned at the beginning in the introduction that part of why we're here today is because I saw a concern by a Sikh and a Christian doing some work amongst Muslims about the concept of friendship evangelism. And I and some colleagues have concerns about this and have written about it before in various blog posts. Can you speak to how that can be unethical, how we can abuse friendships and use them as means to the end, and we end up being unethical in our relationships with others?
I certainly share your concerns in that regard. I think friendships should be valued in and of themselves. And if friendship is simply used as a means to do evangelism, there's something wrong here, something unethical. In my first book, I give an example of my son, who had a friend, a dear friend of his, whose name was Christian, although he was very, very anti-Christian in his overall outlook. And my son and the Christian spent a lot of time arguing and discussing religion. And Christian at one point asked my son, "Would you still be my friend if I told you that I would never become a Christian?" And my son replied, "Of course I would. Our friendship would not be genuine if that were not the case." And I think this is an example of a healthy friendship. There was robust engagement in terms of their religious viewpoints and irreligious viewpoints. But the friendship was valued in and of itself. And when persuasion was involved, it came out naturally as part of their friendship. I think the word natural is very important. I don't think friendship can preclude evangelism, but it should grow out of a natural friendship.
So just to clarify for viewers, you're not saying that people who are friends across religious traditions or even politics or what have you can't be involved in some form of persuasion as a part of their relationship. Your concern, the ethical concern, is when that is used, when the friendship is a little more than just a tool for conversion. Is that correct?
Right. Yes. Very much so. Very much so. Yeah.
There are other areas where I think you and I would share ethical concerns about evangelism by Christians. For example, I live in Utah, and here in Utah, we obviously have a large Latter-day Saint population. And I remember during some of my first early months living in the state, being invited by a Christian friend to go to a pageant, a Mormon pageant that they used to put on in years past. Big affirmations of faith for the Latter-day Saint community, involves a stage play, very professionally well done. And Christian evangelists would go and stand just outside, and they would yell sermons. They would attack the founding prophet of Mormonism and these kinds of things. And I was deeply troubled by that. Unfortunately, it's not the only such instance that goes on. They have these festivals in Dearborn, Michigan, for Muslims, and Christian apologists go in those kinds of contexts. What are your thoughts about how we need to be more ethically sensitive to the ways and spaces in which we engage others that we want to persuade?
Yeah. I certainly share your concerns about that kind of practice. I think here again, the foundational principle that I articulate in the second book, the great commandment, we should love God and we should love our neighbor as ourselves, is critical. We need to combine the Great Commission with the Great Commandment. And so all evangelism must take place within the context of a genuine love for the other person. And that, I think, includes love and respect for the religious space which they are in. So I think there are times where it is simply inappropriate to do evangelism and to do any kind of protesting and encountering. When the golden rule applies here as well. I don't want people to be violating my own religious space. I don't want them to desecrate what I view as sacred. So therefore, I need to do the very same thing in regard to their religious spaces. So respect and care and concern and love for the religious spaces of others. And I think that any kind of denigration of their religious space is just simply wrong.
Let me play devil's advocate if I could. When I offer these kinds of arguments with some Christian colleagues, I get a lot of pushback that I'm somehow not deeply committed enough, that the truth itself can be harsh, and we really have to go in and just shake people up and be almost theologically in their face, if you will. Any thoughts on something like that?
Yes, I have problems with that. I think that we need to speak uncomfortable truth to people sometimes, but I think we can speak uncomfortable truth in a loving way. And we also need to be humble in our approach. So I find that kind of an approach is often colored by arrogance, and I'm just very, very uncomfortable with that. Let's approach the other person with humility, with care, and with love. At the same time, honestly speaking truth where we feel that we need to speak truth.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. In your second book, The Scandal of Evangelism, you discuss evangelism and humanitarian aid. And there's a phrase that you mentioned that you hear a lot: proclamation in word and deed. How do you understand the relationship between the two, if there is one, and how does it relate to evangelism?
This expression comes up a lot. In fact, I find that many Christians today, including some evangelical scholars, use this phrase. And in fact, I find at times that they even say that they would prefer evangelism in deed rather than word. And I have problems with sort of precluding evangelism in word. And I have problems also with the expression evangelism in word and deed. There's something very wrong, and it's very, very misleading. Now, I agree that actions sometimes speak louder than words. But I suggest that really this only happens when words have been spoken beforehand. because you need words to interpret the actions. Actions by themselves are ambiguous. They can be interpreted in various ways. I, as a Christian, can help an old lady across the street as an expression of Christian love, but someone else can help an old lady across the street in order to steal her purse on the way. Atheists are quite capable of doing good deeds as well, and they would want to tell a very different story from the story that Christians tell. So by themselves, actions do not speak. They need to be articulate. They need words to explain and interpret what is going on. Deeds also cannot tell the story of Jesus. Finally, evangelism involves telling the story, the marvelous story of Jesus, and deeds by themselves cannot do that. So again, we need words and deeds. If you study the Gospels, it's very interesting to find that Jesus often talked about he was healing the sick, driving out evil spirits, and proclaiming the gospel. And the word "and" comes up again and again, and I refer to that in my book. So I think these two concepts need to be kept separate. At the same time, we as Christians need to be involved in both. And that, of course, raises the very practical question: what is the practical relationship between humanitarian aid and evangelism? And I think here it's important that we don't give aid simply in order to do evangelism, just like we don't engage in friendship just to be able to do evangelism. We also do not make the giving of aid conditional upon first doing evangelism. Jacob Lowen, anthropologist and Christian missionary in the Chaco in Colombia, has this lovely, in his autobiography, this lovely statement that he used to give the Lord's medicine only after the people had first heard the Lord's message. And after a while, he realized there was something fundamentally wrong with that. We do not make the one conditional on the other. And I have developed a principle in my second book that I'll refer to here. And I suggest that the greater the need, because giving aid involves a power imbalance. And what I'm suggesting is that the greater the need, the more sensitive the persons engaged in providing aid must be to the danger of exploiting that need and thus inducing to convert. So when there's huge physical needs, when humanitarian aid is desperately needed, I think it's inappropriate to do evangelism at that time. It may come later, but again, it should grow out of a natural relationship where that power imbalance has been lessened and we're dealing more with talking to each other as equals.
That's certainly applicable when Christians engage in aid work after disaster responses and in places like India and so on. So that's certainly worthy of reflection. At the beginning, I mentioned a concern that was raised by a Christian working amongst Muslims, the idea that exclusivism in religion equals supremacism. And when I read that, that just sent off red flags, because now we're very concerned and aware of white supremacism and this racial concerns and so on. So the idea of that if I believe my religious tradition is true exclusively to the exclusion of others, or it's truer than other religious traditions, that somehow is supremacist and maybe racist or something else. I'd like you to address that. And the related question is pluralism a better option? If we simply believe that all religious traditions are somehow equally true and value, does that solve the problem? What are your thoughts?
Pluralism is another concept that I think is badly misunderstood. Obviously, there is a pluralism of beliefs and worldviews in our society. That's a factual claim. And the problem that I see today with the notion of pluralism is that we've made it also into a normative concept. And what we have said is that pluralism means relativism, that all beliefs and all belief systems are equally valid. And I think that simply does not follow. And I think a relativistic approach to truth can be shown to be incoherent. Because deep down inside, all of us believe that we have the truth, and that if somebody disagrees, that they've got it wrong. Now that might sound a bit supremacist, and in a way it is, but I don't think it is in an unethical sense. Obviously, when I disagree with someone, I believe that I have the truth and that the other person is wrong, or at least partially wrong. At the same time, if the other person disagrees with me, they believe they have the truth and they think that I've got it wrong, or at least partially wrong. So I prefer an honest approach here, where we acknowledge that we believe that we have the truth, and then engage in humble dialogue, where we together search for the truth. And I think this is where dialogue can come in as well, where we're together humbly admitting that we might be wrong and that we need to search the truth together.
Now you're talking my language, Elmer. Final question for you here. What are your thoughts about the relationship between evangelism and religious tolerance? You and I are Christians. We both believe in sharing our faith as a part of that within in ethically responsible ways and so on. Does that mean that we're necessarily intolerant?
And this is one of the very frequent criticisms made of anybody involved in evangelism. And the word tolerance is just, again, badly misunderstood, I believe. Tolerance, its essential meaning, means putting up with someone that you disagree with. So tolerance, again, you can't associate tolerance with relativism. That again dissipates the need for tolerance even. So tolerance means I put up with, and I respect the other person. He or she has the right to disagree. I put up with that. I listen to them. And I can, at the same time, be tolerant. So I don't think tolerance and disagreement are mutually exclusive. We can disagree and still be tolerant. It's the way in which I express my disagreement that I think we need to pay more attention to.
Again, I couldn't agree more. My guest has been Elmer Thiessen, and I appreciate the work that you've done and taking the time to have this conversation.
Thanks for having me.